Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Of course, you can go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel and, of course, the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. Please, everybody, become my friend over there and pass the show along. And welcome to everybody from Venezuela and Brazil and Gambia. And Atlanta and Washington and so many other places. It's wonderful, wonderful up in New York. That's right. Hey, Jewel. Sending you all so much love down in Memphis. Hey, hey, hey. Good, 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 good to be with you today. I am on the Santita Jackson at Santita J, on X, at Santita J on X. I want to hear from you this morning. We are looking at a new presidency, and even as we speak, people are debating what are we going to do about immigration? What are we going to do about Ukraine? What are we going to do about an expanding war in the Middle East? What are we going to do? And at the center of it all is the military. That's right. The president wants to use the military to deport millions. In the meantime, we've got boots on the ground in the Middle East. And it seems that the footprint of that conflict, that war, now it's becoming a war because armies are going to be opposing each other. And but there's a lot of back and forth. We talked about this yesterday about the swamp, the deep state, if you will. Washington runs the way Washington runs. We saw that with Afghanistan. Now they're looking at courts martial for the Trump administration is for generals who slowed down the process of ending that particular conflict. And they want to go after those people because indeed many people have said that the conflict really, the way that it ended was it's fairly almost inarguable that it was a messy withdrawal. But according to reports, then President Trump wanted a rapid withdrawal. And he got pushback from the military-industrial complex in the personages of the generals. They said, no, you can't do that. It's got to take time. And so now we're looking at courts martial. We're looking at using the military to deport people. We're looking at the military. We're looking at the military. We're looking at the military. How will they be used? What will they be doing? And how do we do all of this responsibly? And I could think of no other person than senior research fellow. He's at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, but I love the header of your organization. You're not speaking on their behalf today, of course, but responsible statecraft. How do we do that? How do we do that? Hey, Ms. Zenobia. Hey, Robert. Shalom, Robert. How do we do that? How do we do that? And where are we going with all of this? I mean, are we looking at World War III? What are we looking at? And I want you all to weigh in on the discussion, but let me just go to you and welcome you back to the show. William Hartung, how are you?
Well as can be expected given the bigger picture, but I'm so glad to be able to talk to you because we need to put our heads together here.
We really, really do. So what is concerning you right now?
Well, there's kind of the immediate and the large. Obviously, the agenda of the new administration is horrific. Mass deportations. I would not be surprised if we didn't see another Muslim ban, trying to control the military. So when he has these unconstitutional ideas like using them for domestic enforcement, nobody stands up and says, you can't do that. I think some of the folks who voted for them are going to have a unpleasant surprise when Elon Musk dismantles half of the federal government. So on that level, there's a lot. And then in my smaller circle, a lot of us work with NGOs based in Washington, and we've been relatively privileged. Under Trump 1, we got a lot of flack, a lot of rhetorical attacks, but it could be worse now. I mean, Trump has said his opponents are vermin. He's going to arrest them. I could easily see them trying to take away the nonprofit status of some progressive groups or scare off donors. So I think essentially we might experience some of what other folks have experienced for a long time.
Well, you asked the question, will President Trump drain the swamp or expand it? What do you mean by that? Number one, what is the swamp? everyone, more and more people are talking about the swamp and the deep state and all of that, and Washington, metaphorically, how does it work? What is the swamp?
Well, essentially, it's kind of this kind of cesspool of money in politics and influence peddling. So, the fact that you've got less 4 out of 5 secretaries of defense came from the arms industry, or that the industry has 800 lobbyists, most of whom came from government, or all the ways that they kind of manipulate legislation and elections and stand in the way of progressive policies. And it's bad enough that both parties kind of give lip service to changing it, Democrat and Republican. And Trump gave an extraordinary speech in Wisconsin during the campaign. Most of it was the usual grievances and they're being unfair to me and I'm your savior and all that. But then there was a little passage where he said, I'm going to drive the warmongers out of the government and the war profiteers. And the reason they have all these wars is because they can make money from missiles. And I've never had a war when I was in office. It was sort of like suddenly he's Mr. Peacenik, and so it was curious given his actual record. But I realized it's because some of his supporters are sick of endless wars. They don't trust these companies. He had to at least make a rhetorical outreach to them. So maybe there's a slight silver lining, and even on that side of the aisle, that they don't support the military-industrial complex. I don't know how we would bridge to work together given all the other issues, but it's an interesting piece of the puzzle,
Well, he has been positioned as a peacenik. What is he really?
Well, he's transactional. He's almost amoral. And so, for example, he made some of these similar noises about the big companies when he was elected in 2016, and he was going to, drive a hard bargain with them. They're ripping us off and so forth. But then his first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia, and he decided he wanted to offer a big arms package so he could show that he was a deal maker who would bring jobs back to America. So he assembled this list worth $110 billion. Some of it was fake, some of it was real, but he wanted a big list. So he had his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, call up the head of Lockheed Martin and say, well, we want to offer him this missile defense system, but it's $18 billion. Could you knock a few billion off the price? And of course they said yes, because they wanted to curry favor with Trump. And so it went. And even to the point of when they murdered Jamal Khashoggi, and there was all this pressure to cut weapons sales, he did a statement saying, well, I don't want to hurt the business of our wonderful defense contractors. And he started naming them off: Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. So essentially he viewed them as a tool to reinforce his political position rather than some big strategic idea of why we should arm Saudi Arabia. But the results were just as damaging to the people on the receiving end.
Well, let me ask you this, just given the structure of our government, and President Eisenhower forewarned us. Well, he warned us of what was to come if we did not get a handle on the military-industrial complex. And when he was writing the speech, of course, his advisors, he wanted to make the military congressional industrial complex. It was just an incredibly cumbersome title, but he said all of these elements are in it. Are not all of our presidents and our highest elected officials, let's just look at the presidency for now, are they not all held captive by the military-industrial complex? Truthfully.
Well, I think what happens is even presidents who might have good intentions to change some of this, once they get in, just the incredible pressure that comes from that lobby makes it hard to do their jobs. Jimmy Carter ran on the platform of human rights and cutting back on arms sales. And he said, people argue that, if we don't sell the arms, somebody else will. And he said that's the justification for all kinds of evil. And he started, he said, we're going to reduce the amounts we sell. We're going to have talks with other countries about doing it and so forth. But by the end, he pretty much abandoned that, partly because his hardline advisors, beginning with Brzezinski, partly because he decided, well, we have to keep arming the Shah of Iran. Of course, that violates this notion of cutting arms sales. So Brzezinski wanted to dangle weapons in front of China to get them to be more on our side on certain issues. And the industry was lobbying almost from day one. He was getting, missives from Tip O'Neill saying, you can't do this. It's going to hurt jobs in our state, in our district. So essentially, I think Carter wanted to do this. And I think there was just kind of this tsunami of political opposition that he couldn't overcome. If you look at President Obama, I think he was misinterpreted by the peace movement. He said he was against the Iraq War and he was against stupid wars, but he wasn't anti-war. He ratcheted up troops in Afghanistan. He increased drone strikes. He used his Nobel Peace Prize speech to talk about kind of just war and how you can't really fully disengage from war as a policy instrument. So certainly he was far better than the alternative. But this idea that we've never really had a peace president, and those who have tried have run up against this lobby.
Yeah, because indeed he had a caveat. He didn't say he was a peace president. He said he didn't believe in dumb wars. He felt that this war was dumb. And
which is a start, but we got to go further.
Well, it's a start, but is it more like a philosophy? Because I've not seen anyone who believed in peace even get close to the presidency. Look, we know how this thing works. The closer you get to it, the suits come in on you, and they want to know who you are. What do you stand for? Everybody, I want you to continue to listen. And I've seen this because I've seen what happened when Reverend Jackson ran for president, right? I saw the suits come in, and that is what they do. So can you be for peace? Can you advocate for peace and be president? Will you be allowed to be president? Indeed, as we are coming up on, the 61st anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, more and more about his record and the fight that he had behind the scenes is coming to light. It was he who said that I want to splinter the CIA into a tiny million pieces. I want to break them up. I want to end them. And he did not want to advance the war in Vietnam. And he really wanted to, he wanted us to have peace. And he started talking about these secret councils that were preventing us from having peace. He had that speech in June of 1963, and then he was dead by November of 1963. So the question is, can we have a president who really is an advocate for peace, whose life can survive it?
Yeah, I think it's partly up to the rest of us. I mean, we'd have to build such overwhelming popular support for peace that even whatever they tried to do, the person in power, we'd have their back, and we would fight back in whatever ways necessary. So we're not there, but I think we're at a moment where we have to really build that kind of force. And I think, the traditional peace movement that I'm part of tends to lean white, older, and they're always saying, well, why don't more people join us? But there's actually, if you look at all the different movements that are taking on militarism in one way or another, militarization of the border, militarization of the police, climate groups that realize the Pentagon is a huge user of fossil fuels and also is, supporting petrostates that are the core of the problem. The anti-nuclear movement. I feel like if we could coordinate better, not have like a new organization, not have people step aside from their primary concerns, but rally together in key moments and sort of bring our force into place, and also just learn more about each other. A lot of the meetings I'm in, let's reach out to this, that, or the other group, but we don't do our homework. We don't sit down. We don't talk. We don't exchange kind of where we're coming from. We don't figure out things like how we're going to protect ourselves and the possible new wave of repression. I think if all that happens, we'll find out that we're a lot stronger than we realized.
Well, let's take some of these conflicts apart, because they are costing us an incredible amount of money. And we know the stated cost, for example, in Ukraine, the stated cost in Gaza and Israel. But many people don't know that if you get just under, say, say you got to report 500 million, but if you get $499,999,999, you don't have to report it, right? And so there's the quiet money that's been tucked into these wars that have cost us an incredible amount of money. You have expressed concern about the real cost, the human cost in Gaza, for example. I mean, Ralph Nader and others, the Lancet study, have talked about principally the Lancet study, the renowned medical journal out of England. A couple of months ago, more than 2 months ago, just more than 2 months ago, they said, look, um, as of a couple of months ago, at least 186,000 people have been killed. We expect to lose about 500,000 by the time this is projected to end. And so now many are suggesting that way more than 200,000 Gazans have been killed. It's unbelievable. We're not even counting what's happening as this conflict has expanded. What is the actual human cost? What does it cost us to have these wars? You've written about that brilliantly.
Well, it's interesting. I work occasionally with the Cost of War project at Brown University, and we released two papers at the same time. Mine was mostly about the costs, economic costs of military aid to Israel since the beginning of Gaza, which was about $22 billion, which is, twice the budget of the Centers for Disease Control. It's huge in domestic terms. It's a small amount compared to the trillion the Pentagon gets every year, but these companies, they'll take what they can get. But the interesting thing was the companion paper about the human costs, where they looked at not just people dying from the bombing, but from starvation, disease. There could be 10,000 people still buried in the rubble. All of that puts it up, probably four times the direct, around the number that you talked about. And if they stop the bombing tomorrow, people would still die from the effects of this war. And that's not even beginning to talk about the trauma of people who've lost relatives, who've lived in refugee camps, who've been hunted by the Israeli military. So it's almost too much to bear. But in that moment, uh, our stuff about the economic costs got a exclusive in AP, traveled all over the world. The stuff about the human costs, we had to really move heaven and earth to get the media to pay attention to. It's kind of this kind of warped thing in Washington where even people who believe in human rights, well, you know, that doesn't fly here. You need another argument, something more practical. And that has to change because all of this is about humanity, about what kind of world we want to live in. It's not about, it shouldn't just be about dollars and cents, but it's everything's backwards now.
Well, I mean, it is backwards. And but it seems that the people who have backwards thinking are running the place. You know,
Indeed, indeed. And people who speak out are gone after. I mean, look what happened to Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. People who spoke out in Palestine had huge amounts of money come in against them, more than I've ever heard of for a congressional race.
well, indeed, this is it is documented. The monies leveled at the Bowman and Cori Bush races are the most that have ever been leveled against against congressional races in our history. They offered Hill Harper $20 million. An APAC affiliated organization offered him $20 million to drop his Senate bid, U.S. Senate bid, and run against Rashida Tlaib. I
Yeah.
mean, what is going on here?
I mean, thankfully, Ilhan Omar is holding strong, I think in Congress, a few strong voices can have a difference. It unfortunately takes too much time, but I think at a certain point, if you have people speaking truth to power inside the Congress, they'll bring some members along if their constituents also push them. But in a time like this, where the slaughter in Gaza is continuing, it's just there's a painful difference between how quickly we can mobilize and how much damage is done in the meantime.
Well, help me to understand. Do you think that Americans have a real sense of what Gaza, for example, is costing us in terms of human life, human capital? I hate human capital, human beings, lives, but also our international reputation. Do you
Uh,
have a sense of that?
yeah, I don't think so. I think some people have bought the argument that, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, under international law, even if one fights back militarily, there's this notion of proportionality. It can't be out of proportion. And as far as we can tell, probably 100 times as many Palestinians has died in the horrific attacks that Hamas did on Israel. So it's clearly out of proportion. The majority of the people being killed are women and children. Most of them were not around when Hamas was elected in 2006. So the idea that you're punishing them for their decision doesn't hold water. And then I think uh, they haven't grasped the enormity of this. I mean, Gaza maybe had 3 million people. This is a huge proportion of that, territory that have been killed or will be, wounded and traumatized for the rest of their lives. And then if you take that, and then you have a Secretary of State who says we support the rules-based international order, he's left out of town by the rest of the world. I mean, I think the ability of the United States to promote any kind of human rights or order, or this will be a stain on that, on our government and on their ability to do many, many different things. And I don't think that people have calculated that. I don't think the government has admitted it. And it's there's no positive for anybody. Even if you support Israel, this war is going to make Israel a pariah state like it has never been before. And whatever small inroads they've made, normalizing relations with other countries, are going to go by the wayside. It's just this idea that this is what's best for Israel is just, an outright lie.
When you become a pariah state, what does that mean? Particularly for people of this generation, people of my generation, people your age, those of us of a certain age, we remember South Africa. And it took a long time, but pressure gradually built up to the point where they had become a pariah state. They were not welcome. It became harder and harder to do business there. Seeing their athletes on the international stage, it was a turn off. I mean, we're beginning to see some of that with Israeli athletes, because that you get the fallout. You're a citizen, you get the fallout. What about that? I mean, what is a pariah state, and what does that feel like? What does that look like?
Well, I would preface by saying, the reason I do what I do now is because of the anti-apartheid work of the 70s when I was in college. And I was involved in the divestment campaign and researching the role of U.S. corporations. We had a committee to oppose bank loans to South Africa. And the thing about it was, some of the people in the said, well, actually, this will hurt the average South African if they reduce investment and so forth.
Well, because
But the
they're
point
going to lose their
was,
jobs, and they're already struggling because
but
we're of the same age group, and so it was the same thing that was happening. We were hearing that, oh, they're going to lose their jobs. They already don't have money, and now you're going to take what little monies they have, right?
and the one thing they forgot to mention is that the liberation movement in South Africa were the ones who were asking us to do this. And even if there was a short-term sacrifice, they wanted to make that to liberate their country.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a kind of opposition strand. There was a minister named Leon Sullivan who had the Sullivan principles,
Right.
and his well, let's just give the U.S. companies rules so they behave better in South Africa. And of course, that was really pro-apartheid when you dug down. And I think it's no mistake that the country that's bringing Israel up on war crimes charges is South Africa. The Israeli government collaborated with the apartheid regime in many different ways back in the day, and that has not been forgotten. But I think, yes, I think, to be a pariah state means trade is harder, getting investment is harder. In the anti-apartheid days, there was movements in sports and entertainment, kind of all sectors. Local governments stopped buying equipment from companies that were in South Africa, divestment movement on campuses. So it became quite a large thing, and the progressive churches were front and center. So it wasn't just like some college kids making noise. It became kind of almost a societal effort to the point where when they passed comprehensive sanctions in '86, they overcame a veto by Ronald Reagan, and a moderate Republican from Indiana, Richard Lugar, was the deciding vote. So we're in a different place now because I think the propaganda related to Israel is much stronger, and they're not just saying let's handle this differently. They're saying, people who oppose Israel are pro-Hamas. People getting suspended, losing their jobs. It's almost like the way they're treating the ceasefire movement. To me, is kind of a test run of what Trump wants to do to all progressives, and it's shameful that the laboratory of taking away free speech and assembly rights is at our universities, which are supposed to allegedly be promoting dialogue and democracy, and have been doing exactly the opposite.
Well, Reagan, when he went in, as you recall, was a frightening figure and very unsettling because he had been so right wing in the 60s, right? And was the foe of the Black Panthers and anything that was progressive or fairly progressive in California when he was governor. And so when he started running for president, it was very unsettling. And when he won, it was frightening. Indeed, one of his opening campaign events was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is famed for being the site of the murders of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. They don't have a bus station. They don't have a train station. They certainly do not have an airport. That he went there to throw signals our way. But something has happened. I mean, he was able to call Israel and stop them from bombing Lebanon. I mean, we had enough push then. You could make
Yes,
phone calls.
and when
What
yeah,
happened?
I mean, when the Marines were bombed in Lebanon, Reagan didn't send in troops. If that happened now, of course there'd be a huge troop deployment. And one parallel, Reagan was an actor, and he spent in the 50s. GE spent him money to go around the country giving anti-communist speeches. Trump is a performer. He's a TV person. My sister-in-law said she voted for him because he was a good businessman. And I said, well, yeah, on television. So there's that kind of circus element, which has this very dangerous policy underneath it. But Reagan, he said Soviet Union's an evil empire. He joked about how the bombing was going to start in 5 minutes. He had a civil defense guy who said, "Oh yeah, we could survive a nuclear war if we had enough shovels to dig little holes for ourselves." So it was horrifying, and he was throwing a bunch of new money into nuclear weapons. But because there was a disarmament campaign, million people in Central Park, freeze campaigns all over the country, reinforcing action in Europe. He actually came around to saying, well, a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And in '86, he and Gorbachev almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. And they certainly came down substantially under Reagan and Herbert Walker Bush. So, we had this sort of awful, dark moment when he came in. And within, say, 6 years, we had turned him around on that issue. So it's possible. I think the difference now, it's many issues at once coming at us, but that's all the more reason we have to have unity in the resistance.
Well, then let us talk about the possibility of nuclear war. I mean, we're seeing now the United States has authorized uh, Ukraine to fire long range missiles into Russia. Everybody, what do you think about that? Abraham, you're down there in Venezuela. We have had a campaign against your government for many, many years. That is not in dispute. What do you think? I want you all to reach out to me. Let me know what you think about the possibility of nuclear war. It seems that we're closer to the actualization of nuclear war than we have been. Bill Hartung of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, we're closer, certainly, than I can remember. I just, what is going on? Because I mean, I'm unsettled by not, I mean, just by our actions, by the actions of our government. It seems that we are provoking. We're trying to prod Russia into a war, and we forget, or maybe it's of no consequence to many of us. Russia shares a border with China. They are in partnership with each other, and they said that they have an unbreakable bond. They do, and for a whole lot of reasons. Talk to me. What are we looking at here?
Well, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists does an annual assessment, the doomsday clock. It's a symbolic representation of how close we are to a possible nuclear conflict. and it's now at 90 seconds to midnight, which I think is the closest it's ever been. And it's partly because of the tensions around Ukraine, probably because they also look at related threats to our existence, like climate change. So, people who've been inside the system, like William Perry, who was Secretary of
Mhm.
Defense back in the day, their concern is that amidst all these tensions, there could be an accidental war. The land-based missiles in the Western United States, um, if the president thought we were being attacked, would have a matter of minutes to decide whether to fire them. And so the concern is there could be an accidental nuclear war in a moment of extreme tension. But that hasn't kept the Pentagon from wanting to build new kinds of every single nuclear weapon, not just the missiles, submarines, bombers, but the warheads. It's going to cost $2 trillion over the next 3 decades. And part of it is this system can get away from itself. They talk about deterrence. Well, if we have enough nuclear weapons, they'll be afraid to attack us because we will devastate them in response. But then they get into all this kind of nuclear priesthood stuff about, well, if they only use X number of weapons, we need the similar weapons. They need to think that we're serious about attacking them, or they won't be dissuaded from attacking us, which means taking more and more dangerous steps to give that impression. And so it's just, it's a nightmare. There was a book by Eric Schlosser, who was more famous for a book called Fast Food Nation, but he had a book called Command and Control about nuclear accidents. Almost, we dropped a bomb on North Carolina by mistake back in the 60s, and it was one switch away from actually going off. There was a missile in Arkansas that came out, explosion in the silo. They couldn't find the warhead for quite a long time. There was a time where the computer system that simulates nuclear war was on, and it was perceived as a real attack, and they had came very close to launching the weapon. So, even in addition to what a malign actor might do, I mean, I think for a head of a country to use nuclear weapons, they would have to think that their life was at stake, that it was all or nothing. But there's situations where that could well happen.
Well, I mean, 90 seconds to midnight, what does that mean? I mean, in real terms, I mean, because I, I'm just trying to figure out if there's an appreciable difference between Biden and Trump. I'm beyond their personalities, and quite frankly, you don't know what someone's personality is when, I mean, because we see people when the cameras are on, quite frankly. And it's just been my experience having known so many of these people in leadership down through the years. The people who are publicly belligerent tend to be peaceful and reasonable. It's behind closed doors, at least that's what it appears. And people who are peaceful publicly tend to be belligerent behind closed doors. Um, I'm just wondering what is going on because it appears that on the way out, on his way out the door, President Biden is ratcheting up these military conflicts.
Yeah, I think, well, on nuclear weapons, I think he is better than Trump. He wants to renew the arms treaty with Russia. He supported the Iran deal, which, Trump abandoned. He has talked about the, making a
No, but wait,
pledge.
but
Yeah,
he's amping thing. He's ratcheting up a conflict with Russia. While he's saying that, to me,
well,
it's
that's
acting
the
aligned.
problem is it's not, his actions aren't aligned with the goal of reducing nuclear tensions. I agree, because especially I'm okay with giving Ukraine the wherewithal to defend itself, but then saying you can use our missiles to strike deep into Russia, it should be a no go, and there should be uh, a diplomatic track of how to end this war, not just this notion that you're just going to pour weapons in and hope for the best. So I think that's a problem. But of course, the Middle East is even worse because even as they claim that they're trying to get um, Netanyahu to rein himself in, the weapons keep flowing, the money keeps flowing. Every time he escalates, like in Lebanon, they said, "Well, don't go into Lebanon." He did. The next thing is, "Well, we've got your back." So it's like Netanyahu is almost setting the pace of escalation, and the administration is backing him. Even in the case of, I don't think they would want to start a war with Iran, but if Netanyahu could possibly push them in that direction, or they could have the illusion that, oh, we'll just do airstrikes and they'll be quick and dirty, which never happens. It always escalates in one way or another. So, yeah, I think especially on the Middle East, the president has lost his way and is really. I mean, the difference is Trump will yell it from the rooftops. I mean, he's already told Netanyahu to finish the job. He brags about every arms deal he ever made. He's a well, he's like a
They're doing the same thing. I mean, and Biden's actions are moving us to the edge. I mean, every peace agreement that has been crafted, it's the United States, the Biden administration that has said reject it, and the UK, by the way, because they're in bed together. What about this? I mean, what is going on here?
well, I think there's kind of this deep seated ideology of uh, having to have an enemy. Back at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was coming apart, Colin Powell famously said, I'm running out of enemies here. All I have is like Cuba and North Korea. And so the Pentagon came up with two things. First of all, they said, well, the enemy has disappeared. We can have a peace dividend. And the neocons said, oh, no, we've got this edge now. Let's use it. Let's shape the world in our image. We're so far ahead, nobody will challenge us. And then the other piece was they created a new doctrine that said, we need to go after rogue states like Iran and North Korea, and we need, X amount of troops to do it. So they came in basically with a new kind of game plan and a new strategy, and people were not having it for a long time. After Vietnam, there was very little support for any kind of overseas intervention. And when they quote unquote won the 91 Gulf War, they said, oh, we've gotten rid of the Vietnam syndrome, which they treated as some sort of disease, which was actually a common sense view of US shouldn't be intervening all over the world. So there's it's kind of a propaganda edge, and also relates to American exceptionalism. We're God's gift to the world, and they even try to sell military intervention as if we're helping people, if it's just some sort of like armed social work, not about the damage that it does. And look at us now. I mean, we've had these disastrous wars for this whole century. $8 trillion, 100,000 people killed, many of our veterans damaged for life, and people still make that peace through strength argument. This is the way we should operate in the world. It's completely unrelated to what's actually been happening, but it's such a strong kind of historical, ideological pull on people. I mean, I think some of the Trump supporters whose lives have definitely gone south economically, they want to be part of a strong country. They want to be part of a country that's the tough kid on the block. And it's almost independent of looking at what's actually happened when our government tries to play that role.
Well, I'm trying to figure all of this out because, the Biden administration says peace, but they don't do peace. And, President Trump said he wants to end the conflict in the Middle East. He said it's bad PR for you all. Okay, that's transactional too. Somebody's got to do something because we're on the brink over there. We continue to expand our footprint, and now officially we have boots on the ground. And quite frankly, we've been provoking uh, the war in Ukraine. I mean, that is what we had an opportunity for this not to happen. I mean, we went back on an agreement that we made when the Berlin Wall was collapsed. They said, okay, sat down with what was the Soviet Union, what was then collapsing, and said, okay, all we ask is that you not expand NATO and become a set of border states on my border. And then we turn around, William Hartung, and that's what we did. I mean, I'm just saying, we are doing things that are, to me, that are so dangerous. I'm wondering how we can come back from any of this because now with new administration, I don't feel comfortable with anyone, quite frankly.
Uh, well, as is appropriate. I think ultimately Putin decided to invade. He has to be held responsible for that. But there's so much that could have been done prior to that to make that less likely. I even go back further when the Soviet Union, fell apart. Rather than engaging with them and trying to make them part of the kind of European order,
Mhm.
um, they refused to do that. And then they went in and did economic shock therapy that stripped their economy. I think at some point it was about half as large as it had been. And that's when Putin wrote in and said, I'm going to restore the economy. I'm going to restore Russian greatness. The mistreatment of Russia back then paved the way for Putin to come to power. So even before NATO expansion, our policy made things so much worse in the region, and really, I think, undercut the possibility of a genuine democracy in Russia.
Well, we did, but that having been said, um, it's just like even this uneven approach that we have to the Middle East. Of course, Israel has the right to defend itself, but people have a right not to be occupied, and they have a right to defend themselves. I mean, the Palestinians are living under conditions that under which no human being should have to live. And I think that's why South Africans have such an alliance with them, and it's not new. It's Yasser Arafat would be in South Africa, and was aligned with Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela and the ANC. There is, I just think that we're functioning. We're in the 21st century, but we have a 19th, 20th century model of who we are. The world has changed. I mean, America is no longer us versus them and a unipolar world. That's not what this is anymore. The colonized nations are rising up. They're becoming economic, not just powers, but superpowers. I mean, do we have a sense of that and what that could mean? Instead of developing alliances with them, we're making them enemies.
Yeah, I think there's some among the elites who understand this and think that we have to have more equal relations with the rising powers, but they're in the minority, and so a lot of the leadership is let's double down on what we know how to do, which is military dominance, military threats. Meanwhile, China is mostly using an economic strategy, and not all of that is just, but they're playing a different game. They're investing in infrastructure all over the world. They're even countries that the U.S. has close military relations with. Often, their biggest trading partner is China. China brokered a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran because they had relations with both sides. The U.S. Could never have done that. So yeah, there's an attachment to this old strategy, which frankly never worked very well. I uh, I helped Jon Stewart with an episode of his TV show about militarism. He had David Petraeus on, and Petraeus was asked, you know, Stewart said, well, after the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan, has this military first approach ever worked? And Petraeus said, well, there was World War II. And so Stewart was like, that's the most recent example you can come up with. We're in big trouble. Um, but it's hard to beat. Progressives who go into government are sort of like to be taken seriously. You have to buy into a lot of that stuff, or at least sit still for it. One of my colleagues resigned from state over Gaza, and she was going to be relatively quiet about it. And many of her colleagues says, "No, you have to speak out. You have to speak for us. I can't afford to give up my job, but I want to." And so there's a handful of folks, Josh Paul and others, who resigned over Gaza, who are trying to spread that message. And Josh Paul started a new organization to try to turn around our Middle East policy. But it's there's got to be some leadership, and people have to feel like. I think one of the biggest things is they have to feel like we can make a difference. I think a lot of folks are unhappy with the direction of things, but they feel like, well, there's too much power, the system's rigged. I'm just going to take care of myself and my family. Wish that were true, but all these things affect everybody's family. So it's not really, you can't wall yourself off from it. And the idea of like, well, I'm not going to listen to the news, it's just going to get worse if you don't have some sense of what's going on. I'm not saying drown in it, but understand the basics of where we are and what we need to do to push back.
But where are we in terms of this um, nuclear race? Just in practical terms, what do you say to Americans, and what should Americans be doing?
Well, there's a strong effort to go back to the Cold War. Things we thought were long settled, like let's put multiple warheads on missiles and let's put more tactical weapons into Europe and let's essentially have yet another military nuclear buildup. In the 60s, there was 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Now there's maybe 15,000. So there's been a drawdown, but it's still enough to end life as we know it. So in practical terms, there's a long way to go. But basically, I think people need to understand that if nuclear weapons are used in any way, life as we know it could well be over. Because not only will people die from blast and radiation, there'll be famine, the weather will be changed. So this idea of threatening to annihilate each other is not a stable system. It relies on, first of all, flesh and blood, flawed human beings who can make those decisions. The U.S. president can order a nuclear attack without consulting anybody. And so to think of Donald Trump with that power, or any president with that power, is just too frightening. So there's an international treaty to ban nuclear weapons, which was an amazing accomplishment, but none of the big powers have signed on to it. So our job is to make that happen.
Well, do you think that do you need water?
Yeah, I can get it while we talk.
Okay, because my question is, and it'll take me a hot second. I think we focus so much on this outsized personality called Donald Trump that we've missed, I think, some dangerous maneuverings of this administration, and we might miss them of all others. And so I'm wondering, because quite frankly, this administration has been unnerving to me, just given the peace that they have not sought, the weapons that they continue to send, that they didn't even tell us about. And I mean, they could have ended the conflict in Ukraine. They wouldn't do it. They told Ukraine, reject any offer of peace. What? Now you see the escalation in the Middle East. For what? And you've got a nuclear superpower saying that, wait a minute, I will use my nukes now. And then you've got Iran saying, if you continue this, America, you will feel this on your shores. On your shores. I don't even think we understand, because, we see, when you go to Europe, you will see bombings. In Paris, you might come back to your hotel, walking down the street, and you'll say, wow, that cafe looks a little different. Yeah, it was bombed this afternoon. Americans have not had to deal with that. And I think it's a new world, Bill Hartoon, because guess what? People are telling us, no, you will have to feel this too. I mean, that is unsettling. And that's happening right now.
Well, yes, and unfortunately, when those things happen, it's not a moment when people stand back and say why. It's a moment when they say, let's double down on militarism. I remember after 9/11, I thought, well, maybe this will be a reckoning. Maybe people will say, why would somebody attack us in this way? But it went the other way. And actually, people who said we needed to change our foreign policy were attacked as being unpatriotic and so forth. And I think likewise now, people who say sensible things about not intervening are tried to they're labeled pro-Putin, pro-Hamas, un-American. It's got that kind of Cold War feel to it. But I think there's a whole separate strand in the ceasefire movement, the kind of emerging movements that are not having that. And I think what we need is the people who are sitting on the fence to come in on the right side. Under McCarthy, they attacked people who, not just the core, people in the Communist Party, but anybody who'd been in any kind of front with them. They viewed the liberals almost as like the weak link. If we make it clear that your career's at stake, if you work with these folks, we can divide and conquer the movement. And I think now, I think their hope is going to be that a lot of people who may be opposed to these policies are going to be afraid to stand up because of what the government will do in return.
And what Facebook do.
Yeah.
Because if you are advocating for peace, Facebook alters your algorithms, and you become more difficult to find. I only have a couple more minutes here, but I want you to have them, because even this has not been a doom and gloom conversation. You've been the doctor who has given us the diagnosis. Now, the prognosis. is what? You've talked about the seeds of resistance, and I want you to come back to talk about that because we're in this moment. The U.S. House of Representatives, uh, they're up for reelection in 2026, which is just under 2 years from now. But in the meantime, there are things that we can do. I mean, as unsettled as many Americans are by the election results, particularly at the top of the ticket, there's still a lot that we can do. Um, and you said that even in this moment, you see the seeds of resistance. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of important movements. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is still quite active. They're just not getting headlines. They're digging in locally and so forth. There's the Poor People's Campaign, which is trying to revive an idea that Dr. King had before he was taken from us. Some of the labor unions are talking about studying how to get their members not have to make weapons to make a living. The fight about the border as a strong anti-militarist component. So if you got on almost every, I was in Minneapolis a little while ago at the American Public Health Association, and they have a peace caucus that's very active on Palestine, that realizes that if these budget priorities go forward, the public health systems are going to be starved even further. So there's all these different groups where they've got one piece of the beast of militarism that they're fighting, and I think there should be a way to unite, while respecting that some of us will have different priorities, but can come together on specific issues, including saving our democracy, fighting back against repression, against killing freedom of speech, against money in politics. There are certain things that affect the terrain that all progressives have to operate on. So I think that, and the last thing I said in my piece was, there's got to be joy in the struggle. In the civil rights movement, people were singing in jail, and I used to work on the United Farm Workers boycott. They had Teatro Campesino, which would perform at events, and anti-war folks had bread and puppet theater. There was a lot of songs and films and culture. I think this could be a long haul. People have to feel like there's some things that sustain us, that nurture us through the struggle. I'm reading a book by Prentice Hemphill, who does kind of therapy for people who are traumatized by just the way the world is. And she's worked with folks in Black Lives Matter and elsewhere. And basically, her notion is, if you can't transform yourself, you can't transform the world.
Amen.
And I think some of the problems in our movements over the years, I mean, the feminist movement was accelerated by the way women were treated in the anti-war movement. A lot of the groups I work with, I see problems in how they treat some of their younger staff and so forth. That has to change. We have to live the values that we are claiming we want the world to, abide by, and all of that is positive. I was, I grew up in a little all-white suburb of Buffalo, New York, and the only kind of fresh air that kind of came in was I used to read essays by James Baldwin, and one of the things he said was that the system of oppression, of course, hits most heavily on the oppressed, but it also deforms and dehumanizes the people who benefit from that system if they don't stand up against it. So to me, there's a positive in taking on these things in terms of just our humanity. And so I think this idea that it's only a sacrifice, it's only a risk, that has to change. I mean, people have to feel like this is almost imperative if we want to build a better world, to stand up now.
And we can build a better world. And I think we're on our way. It's always darkest before the dawn. And it's important for us to remember those songs they weren't top 40 hits, even though Peter, Paul, and Mary, they gave it a good shot, as did Curtis Mayfield and Marvin Gaye. These were God-centered movements. And I think it's important for us to remember that in a time when people are questioning their connection to the Creator. That having been said, that is still the truth. And so
Yes.
I want to thank you for being with us today. And I got to have you back because everything that you've written about, I think you're a prophet. I know you will reject
Well,
that notion.
I think it's more like, you do this stuff forever, and sometimes there's a moment where it's more relevant than other times, and this is the moment. I used to get flack on shows like, well, Bill, you've been doing this for 40 years and nothing's changed. Well, A, it's not just up to Bill. but also we've had victories along the way. There's hope. We have to tell our own stories. We can't accept this notion that
Right.
change is not possible.
Well, Mary McKeever said that, when basically, to paraphrase her, when the hunted writes the history, things do change and the narrative changes. And I thank you for speaking for those who've been the prey, for people who've been the hunted. Thank you so much, Bill Hartung, from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Senior Fellow, sending you so much love today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad we had this conversation.
Oh, can't wait to have you back so we can have some more. Everybody, stay tuned. We are going to be talking about Rahm Emanuel. Don't faint, Bill Hartung. The idea has been floated that he could become chair of the DNC. What do you think about that?
Oh, Lord help us, right?
Now, there you go. What a segue. More of the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, a voice of progressive Minnesota. Stay right here.